men, one in his late teens, the other mid-20s, both wearing long coats, were the focus of the woman's concern. The older man had short fair hair, the younger's was darker and longer. It was soon also clear that they were carrying semi-automatic rifles. The light in the room seemed suddenly very bright, sounds abnormally clear and dry. One of Trent's crew of slackers had just time to say, "Billy?" in a tone of goofy bafflement, and then the two men started shooting. They stood in the central aisle and fired calmly and quickly, the stocks of their rifles securely anchored in their shoulders. As the first casualty jerked backward, an expression of wordless surprise on her face, the gunman moved on, intently, earnestly. After another second and two more deaths, everyone in the restaurant suddenly fought their way up out of bewilderment. Time hit the ground running, and the screaming started. They tried to flee or hide or to pull other people in front of them. Some made a break for the doors, but the guns turned as one and took down the deserters efficiently. Their line of fire swept past the out-of-towners, and Mark Campbell took a direct shot in the back of the head at about the same time his wife's face was spread over a spiderweb of cracks in the plate-glass window that halted both of the bullets' progress. Trent died soon afterwards, halfway to his feet, on a doomed mission to throw himself at the gunman. Few were sufficiently self-possessed to even consider such positive action, and those that did died quickly. In a room full of victims, murderers look like gods. The men kept shooting, rifles turning together to rain fire on an unexpected corner of the room. They reloaded a number of times, though never at the same moment. They were very efficient. Neither said anything throughout the entire incident. The distant sound of approaching sirens became evident. The gunman fired for perhaps another 20 seconds, then they stopped. Of the 59 people in the McDonald's that lunchtime, only 31 heard the deadened report of the final shot. 12 of those were dead before dark, bringing the toll to 40. One of the little girls survived. She was fostered out to an aunt in Iowa. One of Trent's friends made it, and 4 years later was a Coast Guard on Laguna Beach. Pete Harris also survived. Susie Campbell's body had crashed on top of him just as he tried to slip under his table. The gunman looked around the room, faces betraying no reaction to what they'd done. The boy called Billy took a step back and shut his eyes. The other man shot him point-blank in the face. While Billy's body still spasmed on the floor, the man squatted to wash his hands in the blood. He stood again to write something on the glass door, working calmly, in big, dripping letters. He didn't even glance at the cop cars hurtling up Main. Then the man jumped through the shattered window and disappeared, escaping, it was believed, along the track of the old railroad line. He was never apprehended. No one was ever able to give a clear description of his face, and in time it was as if he had slipped out of the event and into shadow. When he heard the sound of the police cars pulling up outside, Pete Harris raised his head far enough to see what had been written in blood on the doors. His eyesight was clouded by a white light in his head, but the words were clear enough. They said, "The Straw Men." 11 years passed. The funeral was a nice affair, in that it was well attended and nobody stood up at any point and said, "You realize this means they're dead." So far as I'd known, my parents had no religious views, save a kind of amiable atheism, and after the preacher had explained to everyone why death was not the complete downer it might first appear, we filed out of the church. Outside, the air was crisp and silent. Behind the graveyard rose the foothills of the Gallatin Range, the peaks in the distance muted as if painted on glass. 2 side-by-side plots had been prepared. There were about 15 people on hand to witness the burial. Harold Davids was there, and Mary stood close to me, white hair pulled back in a bun. A few more sentences of balm were offered, but muttered quickly now, as if the church recognized that the time to make its pitch was running out. You can't put people in wooden boxes under the ground without the audience realizing that something very amiss is afoot. A final, quiet pronouncement, and that was that. Nothing would ever happen to Donald and Beth Hopkins again. Nothing that bore thinking about, at least. When Mary had called me 3 days before, I'd been sitting on the deck of a nice small hotel on De La Vina in Santa Barbara. I was unemployed again and using my scant savings on an undeserved vacation. I was sitting with a good bottle of local Merlot in front of me, and when my cellular rang, I was inclined to let the message service pick it up, but when I glanced at the phone, I saw who the caller was. I hit the talk button. "Hey," I said. "Ward," she replied. "Oh, Ward, you better come here." In the end, I got her to tell me. A car crash in the center of Dyersburg, both dead on arrival. Now, she dug in the pocket of her coat and brought out a set of keys. "I put out the trash this morning," she said, "and took a few things out of the refrigerator, milk and such. Everything else I just left. They spoke of you, you know. Often." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed her. For much of the last decade, my parents hadn't even known where I was. It wasn't that we hadn't loved each other. I just hadn't given them much to talk about, had checked none of the boxes that make parents prone to brag to friends. No wife, no kids, no job to speak of. "How long will you stay?" Mary asked. "Maybe a week, possibly less. You know where I am. You don't have to be a stranger just because I won't," I said, smiling awkwardly. She smiled back, as if she already knew this was not the way things worked. "Goodbye, Ward," she said, and then set off up the slope. At 70, she was a little older than my parents, and walked awkwardly. She was a lifelong Dyersburg resident, an ex-nurse, and more than that, I didn't know. I saw that David's was standing by his car on the other side of the cemetery, evidently waiting for me. I glanced back at the graves, and then walked heavily down the path to face the administrative tasks created by the loss of my entire family. David's had brought most of the paperwork in his car, and took me to lunch to deal with it. We ate in historical downtown Dyersburg, at a place called Auntie's Pantry. The interior had been slavishly designed to resemble a multi-level log cabin, the furniture hand-hewn by elves. The menu offered a chilling variety of organic soups and homemade breads, accompanied by salads largely predicated upon bean sprouts. I don't know of any aunt on this planet who eats this kind of shit, but both staff and patrons seemed about as happy as could be, almost maniacally so. Harold Davids was my parents' attorney, and had been since they'd met him after moving from Northern California. He recapped the circumstances of my parents' death, which in the absence of witnesses boiled down to a single fact. At approximately 11:05 on the previous Friday evening, after visiting friends to play bridge, their car had been involved in a head-on collision at the intersection of Benton and Ryle Streets. The other vehicle was a stationary car, parked by the side of the road. The post-mortem revealed blood alcohol levels consistent with maybe half a bottle of wine in my father, who had been the passenger, and a lot of cranberry juice in my mother. The road had been icy, the junction wasn't too well lit, and another accident had taken place at the same spot just last year. That was that. It was just one of those things, unless I wanted to get involved in a fruitless civil litigation, which I didn't. Then Davids got down to business, which meant getting me to sign a large number of pieces of paper. I was listening with less than half of my attention, and only resurfaced when Davids mentioned unrealty. He explained that my father's business, through which he had successfully sold high-priced real estate, was being shut down. The value of its remaining assets would be forwarded to any account I cared to nominate. "He wound up unrealty?" I asked. "When?"
"No," David shook his head. "He gave instructions that this should take place upon his death."
I understood now why Davids had insisted that we go through the papers today, rather than in the period before the funeral. I collected up my copies and shoved them into the envelope Davids had provided. "Is that it?" My voice was quiet and clipped.
"I think so."
Outside we stood together for a moment, watching well-heeled women roving up and down College Street in hungry packs, charge cards on stun.
to keep listening to this audiobook. I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.